Major changes are going to come to Russia under Peter the Great. And so Peter the Great is going to become really the first Russian Tsar that works to try to modernize and westernize Russia. And so when he takes over, he realizes that Russia was far behind Western Europe. And so he actually sends Russians overseas into Western Europe to study, and he even himself is going to travel to Europe to originally he was traveling to Europe to try to find allies to fight Turkish powers in Europe. But as he did that, he travels incognito as a common person, and he studies European government and military and industries. And then he brings all of that back to Russia with him and implements this period of rapid modernization and westernization. And so, first off, when we look at Peter the Great's reforms and his changes to Russia, he did not want anything that would challenge his autocratic rule. And so he was very selective about what he brought back to Russia with him. But it started with two things: the military and the bureaucracy. And so the military, he wanted to build up and modernize Russia's military. And his whole goal was to be able to win conflicts in Eastern Europe. And so he starts out by building kind of a more organized military modeled after European styles, and offers better pay and brings in modern weapons from Europe. He builds a huge European army, creates new universities to train his soldiers. For example, one of the things they needed to study was math and geometry so that they could better aim cannon trajectories and things like that. He also builds the first navy for Russia as well. And so by building up this military, it actually works. And he's going to defeat Sweden in the Great Northern War in 1700. And this is going to give them new territory and also access to the Baltic Sea. He also creates a secret police system that's going to survive all the way into the 1990s. So updating the military was one of his key focus areas. The other big focus area was the bureaucracy. And one of the main reasons for improving the bureaucracy was to kind of streamline the tax collection system. And so he creates a new bureaucracy that was based on merit, and recruited new nobles to serve in the bureaucracy based on loyalty to him and merit, creates and kind of reforms older codes of law in order to streamline the bureaucracy. Now, when it came to social reforms, they do bring in a lot of Western culture, but again, it was very selective and really only impacted the upper classes. But they're going to bring in things like ballet will be introduced from France. Women are going to benefit greatly from these social changes. Russian women were far behind Western European women when it came to freedom and rights. And so he's going to encourage new rights for women. And so Peter and his reforms were actually pretty well liked by upper class women because they did gain new freedoms. He encouraged mixing of the sexes in public, and really opened up a lot of opportunities for women, and got rid of some older patriarchal traditions that were well embedded in Russian society. He also orders upper class men and women to wear Western style clothing. And one of the best examples of this is ordering men to shave their beards, because Western European men tended to shave their beards, whereas Russian men tended to have these long beards. And so he ordered Russian nobles to shave their beards, and would even go out in public and shave and cut people's beards right out in public. And if you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay an extra beard tax. He's also going to build a brand new city, St. Petersburg, modeled after Western European cities, and builds it on a swamp and tons of peasants died in building St. Petersburg, but it's going to become a new capital built right on the Baltic Sea and becomes a new headquarters for the new Russian Navy as well. When we look at this process of westernization, first off, the difference between westernization and modernization. Westernization is the copying of the West, specifically Western Europe. And so you're changing your own traditions. You're replacing your culture with Western culture. It includes social and economic and political changes as well. Modernization, the goal behind modernization is to update your technology without the cultural borrowing. And so when we look at what Russia did, the best term for it is selective westernization. They did modernize, but there were also aspects of Western culture that were introduced. However, they were very selective in what they brought over. And so another important aspect of this is that this wasn't a natural process. This was forced from the top down. This was Peter the Great forcing modernization and westernization on the nobles. And so when we say selective westernization, nothing that challenged autocratic rule was brought to Russia. Peter the Great did not want any kind of Enlightenment ideas that were starting to spread in Europe brought over. He wanted to keep his absolute power. Also, no changes in serfdom. That's one of the biggest things that's going to hold Russia back during this period, is they remain reliant on serf labor. Also, almost all of these reforms really only impacted the upper classes. There was no major changes for your lower classes. Also, no commercial economy. Russia's going to remain very agricultural, and they do industrialize a little bit. They're going to bring in some metal industry, a little bit of textile industries as well. But as they do create these factories, these manufacturing centers, it was held back by this reliance on serfdom, because they just tried to use serfs in these manufacturing industries, and ultimately it didn't work very well. So following Peter the Great, we have a series of several kind of weak czars and czarinas that take over. And then we get to Catherine the Great. So Catherine the Great marries Peter's grandson, Peter III. But Peter III was a very unpopular czar. He was also mentally unstable as well. And their marriage was never good. They hated each other. Catherine II even supposedly didn't like her own son. And so Catherine II is going to replace Peter III as Tsarina when Peter III is murdered, possibly at the wishes of Catherine. And so she makes a deal with the Russian boyars that if they would support her as Tsarina, she would increase their power over serfs and increase kind of their local autonomy. And so they do. And so she's going to continue some of Peter the Great's ideas of westernization and modernization. She was even attracted to some Enlightenment ideas. She even brought over several prominent French philosophers to visit Russia. She even wrote letters to Voltaire. And so she was initially slightly attracted to Enlightenment ideals. However, much like Peter the Great, she didn't want anything that would challenge her autocratic rule. And so during Catherine's reign, we're going to see nobles gain quite a bit of power over serfs. Serfs are going to struggle under Catherine the Great. Nobles were allowed to force labor from their serfs. They were allowed to collect taxes from their serfs. They were even allowed to issue punishments for crimes. So Catherine the Great's attempts at westernization and modernization are going to be somewhat stifled by Pugachev's rebellion. Pugachev's rebellion Pugachev was a Cossack chieftain who leads this rebellion of peasants and serfs, and they tore up the countryside. They killed nobles, and ultimately, Pugachev had promised to abolish serfdom. He claimed to be the legitimate czar, and Catherine II eventually is going to capture him, put down Pugachev's rebellion. He's actually taken to Moscow and executed on the public square and quartered. But it kind of soured her on these changes. And so following this, we see her kind of revert back to the old ways and that strong autocratic rule, especially after the French Revolution. When you combine Pugachev's rebellion and the French Revolution, they kind of made her leery of these ideas of Westernization. She didn't want these ideas seeping into Russia and causing similar issues in Russia. And so she's going to kind of turn away from some of this Westernization and modernization as a result.